Hi there, and welcome to Ian's Engage channel. I'm Ian. Now, I know I said my previous video would be my final one of the year, and that I wouldn't be posting for a few weeks.
I think I'm going to take a break from posting videos for a few weeks.
But I thought this would be a more fitting one to end the year with. So, here we go. In a previous video, I showed how I decided to plan ahead for the future expansion of Shelfington. In this video, I'm going to begin putting those plans into action and reflect on what I've learned since beginning to build Shelfington earlier this year. So, I think we should first have one last look at Shelfington before the demolition process begins. Now, this isn't as drastic as it sounds, and was always going to happen as I'd always intended laying the track onto cork and not directly onto the foam itself. And now that I was happy that the track plan worked operationally, the time was right to start laying it down more permanently. However, to do that, everything had to come up. So, locos and rolling stock were boxed up and packed away, and I began the process of disassembling my layout. It may not have been a drastic action, as it was born out of necessity, but it was certainly a bit of a sad one, as I removed all of my hard work. However, what I'd done so far had been an excellent learning experience, so I thought it would make sense to reflect on what I'd learned about building Shelfington so far. I'd learned that I wasn't too bad at building baseboards, as long as I kept away from jigsaws, which were, of course, the devil's work. I'd learned that however big your baseboard, it was never big enough, so planning to be able to expand it would have been a useful thing to have done from the start. I'd learned that fitting multiple baseboards together and keeping them level was quite tricky when they'd been built independently with no intention of joining them. I'd learned how to fit stubborn fish plates to flexible track without turning the air blue every single time I tried. I'd learned how to fit stubborn fish plates to streamline points without turning the air blue every single time I tried. I'd learned to keep calm when trying to connect a piece of flexi-track to a piece of set track, and not to hurl said pieces of track across the train room when that process took longer than 5 minutes. I'd learned how to count to 10 when I thought fish plates were fitted between tracks perfectly, when in fact one of them had slipped under a rail instead of onto it. I'd learned that I did not like N-gauge fish plates, and that they were also the devil's work. In not totally unrelated news, I'd learned that my eyesight needed some serious help when dealing with all things N-gauge, and that a magnifying headset made coping with the tiny details a bit easier. I'd learned how to solder dropper wires to the bottom of rails, and was no longer scared of the soldering iron. Well, not totally scared of it. I'd learned that soldering complex sections of track together could help with manoeuvring them into awkward places, and that soldering track improved the electrical conductivity, meaning less dropper wires were required. I'd learned how not to melt sleepers when soldering pieces of track together, or when adding dropper wires. I'd learned how to cut pieces of flexible track to the correct length, and how to manipulate fish plates into position when joining two sections of track that were already fixed in place. I'd learned that short curved sections of flexible track were not to be used unless absolutely necessary, or unless you wanted to send yourself insane trying to keep them curved. I'd learned that trying to bend short sections of flexible track into S-curves would take you on a journey into madness, and should be avoided at all costs. I'd learnt that a small plastic Pico 6-foot weigh gauge was an invaluable tool for helping to keep parallel tracks a fixed distance apart. I'd learned all about DCC, which was completely new to me since I was last in the hobby back in the 1980s. I'd learned that a multimeter was a must-have device for working out where connectivity issues of my own making, such as dry solder joints, were causing problems. I'd learnt that a GaugeMaster track tester tool was an excellent gizmo for quickly telling you whether your track was connected electrically, and was especially useful for testing conductivity across soldered track joints. I'd learned how to work with XPS foam, including how to cut it, shape it, and glue it without melting it. I'd learned all about different types of glue, and which ones would stick different types of material together, but more importantly, which materials they wouldn't stick together. I'd learned that I had a love-hate relationship with rocket card glue, but I mostly hated the stuff. I'd learned how I was going to create a removable scenic breakboard, which was way simpler than I was expecting it to be. I'd learned how to use my project planning and software design skills to become a civil engineer for my miniature world, and had drawn up several plans for Shelfington. I'd learned how to implement, test and modify the plans until I was happy that I had one that would work well and could be added to in the future. I'd learned that a clean track was a happy track, and that an abrasive track cleaning rubber was the best way to clean it. I'd learned everything about point motors and how to control them, and I mean literally everything. I'd learned that blue tack was an excellent, if unlikely, solution to stick a back seam to a wall. I'd learned that really useful boxes were, well, really useful for storing locos, rolling stock, models and track when not on the layout. I'd learned that I really enjoyed planning and experimenting, and that procrastination is really a good thing. I'd learned that the hobby was a money pit, and that money pit was deeper than you ever imagined before you started. I'd learned that I really enjoyed documenting my progress, and that there was a fantastic community of like-minded people here on YouTube, who were kind, friendly, understanding, and always willing to give support and advice. However, most of all, I'd learned how to be confident in my own ability, and realised that if I didn't know how to do something, there was always someone who did know how to do it, and even better, they'd made a video about it that could help me understand how to do it as well. So, I guess my hard work hadn't all been for nothing, and I seem to have learned a lot, which was great. Okay, so that's about it for this update. This will definitely be my final update for the year, and I'll now be taking a short break before uploading again while I figure out how I'm going to put everything back together again. In the meantime, Happy New Year and best wishes to everyone for 2023. Thanks ever so much for watching my videos this year, and hopefully I'll have another one to watch in a few weeks' time. Bye.